Good evening to all present here. I, Shriya, welcome you all on behalf of Breakthrough Science Society Karnataka to our J.R. Lakshman Rao Birth Centenary webinar series. Today's talk is on the topic Science in Ancient India, the True Achievements. India has made many contributions to science. Let us understand these contributions as they are through scientifically backed claims and take pride in them. These claims will lie in contrast to what is propagated as Indian knowledge systems, which are now being introduced in academic curricula as part of new education policy. You can also read of the Science in Ancient India, the book published by Breakthrough Science Society. It is available on Amazon. Link will be put in the chat box. That is on the Facebook comments. I would like to welcome Dr. Soumitra Banerjee, who will be throwing light on this topic. Welcome, sir. Dr. Soumitra Banerjee completed his BE from Bengal Engineering College in 1981 and MTech from IIT Delhi. He was faculty member of IIT Kharagpur since 1986 and then moved to Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, ISER, Kolkata in 2009. He is a recipient of the prestigious S.S. Bhatnagar Prize and was recognized as a highly cited author by Thomson Reuters from 2004 to 2014. He is a fellow member of the Indian Academy of Sciences, the Indian National Academy of Engineering, the Indian National Science Academy, the World Academy of Sciences, and the IEEE. He is also an organizer of Science Movement in India, taking an active part in the India March for Science movement, and is the All India General Secretary of Breakthrough Science Society. I now request Sir to present about Science in Ancient India, the True Achievements. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shreya. I will now put my sharing on. I suppose you can see my slide, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. I will not be able to see you, so if there is any difficulty, just tell me so that I'll be able to hear.
Sure.
As this is in memory of Dr. J.R. Lakshman Rao, who was a towering personality in the field of science, I would like to take this topic in a very serious way, because this has now become a very important issue that needs to be discussed all over the country, because it is a part of the new education policy. The government plans to propagate that, government plans to put that into the curriculum, and that we need to discuss. And as Dr. J.R. Lakshman Rao was always in favor of propagation of scientific truth, on this issue also, we need to know what is the scientific truth. And when we talk about scientific truth, we always talk on the basis of evidence. So, when I will talk about science in ancient India, your demand should be that I should base myself on evidence, what we really know, which is not part of our imagination or personal thinking, but something that is supported by evidence. Well, let's start. The history of India is normally divided into a few time periods. The Indus Valley civilization spanned approximately a period from 3500 BC to about 1800 BC. These are all approximate, so I have put a tilde in front. And then the Vedic age started around 1500 BC to about 600 BC. You might ask, what is the evidence? Well, the Indus Valley civilization's time period is evidenced by the findings which can be dated. So radiometric dating can be done, so we know more or less clearly their time periods. The Vedic age's time period cannot be directly dated that way because we do not have any document, any monument coming from that time. No building, no no physical artifact of that time that can be dated. But we have the literature, and literature forms a way of dating the times. So we know for sure that the Vedic age started around 1500 BC and it continued about till 600 BC. Why 600 BC? I'll come to that later. The post-Vedic period is about 600 BC to about 1100 AD, 11th century. And then we have the medieval period. And we say the medieval period ended around 1850 because that is when the Indian Renaissance had its onset. So we have the modern age starting from that time. So when we talk about ancient India, most people have a nebulous idea about what time we are talking about. And that's why I will divide the presentation into these specific timings and talk about what happened in each of these timings. So let's start with the Indus Valley civilization. It actually encompasses a very large geographical extent. You can see that very large area, but there is a commonness found in almost all the Indus Valley cities. It's a very large area, about 10 lakh square kilometers, and the timing is given. Now, in all the cities, you will find there is a raised citadel on which a granary was placed. This particular citadel that you can see right here is not of that time because later a Buddhist stupa was built there in Mohenjo-daro. So this is not exactly the thing I'm talking about, but I'm saying that that area is an elevated area on which a granary stood, and in the foreground you can see the Great Bath. And the common features are this kind of drainage systems, the wells. So private houses were there. Almost each one had its own bath. The water drainage system, the toilet consisting of brick seat and things like that, brick lined drains, sometimes mostly covered drains. So all these are signatures of relatively advanced state of civil engineering. And the town plan was regular, and the bricks were all of the same ratio, 1:2:4 ratio. And so the regularity in the plan of these buildings suggests some kind of a organization, bureaucratic organization. But still, we do not see any monumental architecture. No big house, no palace, no big temple. So therefore, the historians have concluded that that was in a relatively primitive state of class division. Now let us come to what science was there at that time. Now notice this particular Great Bath structure. It is a rectangular structure oriented in a particular way, and in order to make such a bath, you need to be able to construct right angles, right? You need to be able to construct a rectangle. So these geometrical structures, you have to be able to construct these structures in order to make such a thing. Obviously that knowledge was there. And then they had these weights and measures that also talk about some development of human knowledge. And the seals that were found there, that contain some geometrical shapes. And that talk about some development of geometry. Unfortunately, we have not been able to decipher their written script, and so we do not have exactly a clear idea as to how much they knew and in what form. But these are evidence of what they actually could achieve. And in metallurgy, obviously, they achieved a high degree of finesse in bronze. It was a Bronze Age civilization. So that needs some degree of finesse in extraction and the use of copper, zinc, tin, etc. So you have to have places where zinc is mined, tin is mined, And some of these places were not in the Indian subcontinent, so they had to source these from places. So there was trade in these. So that also needs some development of social organization. So at some point we know that around 1700 BC there was a decline, and many of the similar ancient civilizations, ancient city civilizations, also show such decline. We have such evidences in similar civilizations in South America. Suddenly everybody vanishes, disappears. There can be various reasons for that: climate change, long drawn drought or flood, the decline in agricultural production due to various possible positive factors. And so in order to sustain a city-based population, which itself does not produce any agriculture, so it has to be sustained by the adjoining areas. If that is not possible, then the city cannot survive. So at some point of time, we know that people dispersed, or there can be plague or some other disease. So the cities were abundant around 1700 BC. And we see the onset of the Vedic age after that. So there was a gap between these. So let us come to the Vedic age. Much is being said about the development of science in the Vedic age. So we need to understand what actually happened during that time, or how much development of science happened at that time. So around 2500 BC, some Aryan speaking, Aryan is a group of languages, it's not a race, a group of languages. So Aryan speaking tribes migrated from the Asia Minor to various places, including one branch entered the Indian subcontinent. Sometime between, or not one branch, there was a series of migrations over a few centuries maybe. And these people were horse riding, pastoral, migratory tribes. They did not know agriculture, but they lived on animal husbandry, and they did not have written language. That's also something we know, while the Indus Valley people did. And this is more or less the reconstructed routes of migration. And you can see one route goes into India. That is what seems to have happened around 1500 BC. So you might ask, what evidence do we have about that age, that time? We have the written evidences. We have the Vedas, Vedanga, Vedanta, Puranas, Upanishads, Brahmanas, Samhitas. All these were written during that period. And since we do not, as I said, we do not have any material object to date with, these actually form our basis of dating and understanding of that culture. Now with that these literature also allow us to understand what kind of science they did, or how much science advanced during that period. For example, numbers, one elementary thing in all sciences, numbers. How did they write the numbers? We know that they wrote the numbers in a 10-based system. So there are basically 9 number symbols, 1 to 9, and 0 had not been discovered at that time. So in place of 10, they would need another symbol. So there would be a symbol for 10, and then 10 followed by the symbol for 1 would be 11, 10 followed by symbol for 2 will be 12, but that way you can go only up to 19, and for 20 you'll need another symbol. So that way the symbols were large in number, but in spite of that obvious limitation, they could conceive large numbers. They had names for the numbers, large numbers. For example, a trillion had also a name. A crore, a million, a billion also had names. They could conceive fractions, say 1/4, 3/4, those fractions they could conceive. For that time, these were remarkable achievements. Now, the Sulba Sutras actually embody certain development in geometry. These are actually the manual for construction of Yagnavedis. And the instrument they had was just a thread. So Sulba means a thread, Sutra means the rule of the thread. So essentially that is what. But in those, there are 7 of those Sulba Sutras written over a period about 800 BC to about 200 BC. In that, we find the method of identification of the true east-west line, because when you start making Yagnavedi, it has to be east-west, north-south oriented. It's not easy to identify the north-south line, but it's easier to identify east-west. But that's not very easy though. They figured out how to do that. They figured out how to draw perpendicular bisectors using threads. They figured out the value of square root of 2, and in that, in the Sulva Sutra, we find this first statement of the Pythagoras theorem. It was not by Pythagoras, so Pythagoras was far later. So we know that the Pythagoras theorem was definitely known to the Egyptians, because they could not have constructed the pyramids without that knowledge. The Pythagoras theorem, actually the Pythagoras triads, were known to the Babylonians. We know the statement of the Pythagoras theorem was there in the Sulva Sutras, and we know that the proof of the Pythagoras theorem was first derived by the Chinese mathematicians. All these were before Pythagoras. So Pythagoras' contribution is not really the Pythagoras theorem. His other contributions are more profound. They also, in Sulva Sutra, we also find interesting ways of drawing circles and squares of the same area. Not an easy mathematical problem, but they approximately solved it. Not accurate, but approximate. I'll not go into the details because today I'm not dealing with mathematics part of it. In astronomy, whenever any society engages in agriculture, they have to formulate a calendar, because you have to sow the seeds at a particular time, you have to reap the produce at a particular time, so you have to have a calendar. Every society has formulated a calendar, and so when in the Vedic period, around 1000 BC, initially when they came, they did not know agriculture, but agriculture started around 1000 BC. So after that, an effort to formulate a calendar started, and calendars are always formulated on the basis of the things that are periodic in nature, and the clearly periodic events are the motion of the moon and the sun. So they observed the moon and the sun and could formulate a calendar. And the Vedanga Jyotisha is, there are 6 Vedangas, this is one of these. But remember, this word Jyotisha is not the same as astrology. In those times, Jyotisha was used in the sense of astronomy. And in fact, astrology as a school of thought, whose basis is the belief that the life of a human being is determined by the time of birth. That's a belief, and that can be found out by producing the charts, almanacs, and things like that. So this kind of belief, and that fate can be changed by wearing certain stones. All these kind of beliefs were not there during the Vedic period. This came into India at a later time. So Vedic astronomy, actually they counted months on the basis of phases of the moon, and the year on the basis of the motion of the sun, the way we do today. And in Yajurveda, the year comprising of 12 solar months and 16 ritus were clearly demarcated. And the year was divided into 2 parts, the Uttarayana and Dakshinayana, when the sun goes up to the north and sun goes to the south. And then they could identify these solstices, summer and winter solstices, and they knew the shortest day was the winter solstice. And remarkably, all their attention was focused on the sun. And sun, moon, and all these bodies pass through a narrow strip across the sky. So they needed to identify positions on that narrow strip, the zodiacal strip. So they named 27 stars along that path, 360-degree path, so that they can tell each other about what is the position of the sun and what is the position of the moon. Sun is near this star, moon is near that star, that way. So 27 stars were named. We still carry those same names. In medical science, Atharva Veda was developed. It contains many ideas of anatomy, physiology, and medical science, medicines. But in Atharvaveda, we find two clear ways of thinking in the same literature. One sees the disease as being inflicted by some demon or some soul. Uh, and so the practices were of the occult kind, something whose objective is to drive away the demon. While there was another trend which tried to cure the disease using some material thing, like the medicinal plants, like some salts, like some alkaline substance, things like that. The people who practiced that used to be called the Vishaks. Now, that Vishak trend later developed into what is known as the Ayurveda. But that was in the post-Vedic period, not in the Vedic period. So, Ayurveda developed as a subset of the development of a subset of the Atharvaveda. Notice that this time, this phase, the anthropologists demarcate that as what is known as the magic phase, because in the Rig Veda you see the chants and hymns, and these hymns are in praise of the gods and goddesses. But if you notice, the gods and goddesses are actually embodiment of some material power, like the wind, like the sun, or some Aryan leader like Indra. So they were not abstract entities, they were very embodiment of some material things. And that is why the anthropologists say that the content of the thought process of that time was actually materialistic. And so they term it as a magic phase because all they did by those chants and hymns were trying to please those material entities by some kind of a magic. And that is why in the Vedic hymns, you see a healthy curiosity about natural phenomena. In continuation of that, naturally, if there is a curiosity of natural phenomena, there would be discovery of natural phenomena. So that was what was expected, but that's in some sense that is what happened. But there is a common misconception that spiritualism is the characteristic feature of the Vedic times. Actually, many materialistic schools of philosophy existed, like the Lokayata or Charvaka philosophy, the Nyaya Vaisheshika philosophy, the Sankhya philosophy. Today's interpretation of Sankhya and Nyaya have many non-materialistic components, but these are today's interpretation. Many scholars have commented that the Nyaya Vaisheshika philosophy that existed at that time, the Sankhya philosophy that existed at the time, were in content materialistic. In fact, Lokayata did not believe in the existence of Atma or soul. And they theorize that everything is made of four substances, Chaturbhuta, earth, water, air, and fire. And later, at a later stage, another was added to it, the Panchabhuta, the element of the sky was added to it, Vyom. So with that, I will end the Vedic period. You would notice that there is a particular stage of development, and that stage of development is remarkable in certain senses, especially the development of literature, philosophy, very remarkable development. But I must, before going to the other part, I must let me comment that nowadays there is something called Vedic mathematics which is being introduced. Now this Vedic mathematics, you notice that in the Vedic time, the mathematics did not have the concept of zero. The place value system was not there. So obviously, if you talk about Vedic mathematics, you have to talk about the mathematics without the zero, without the place value system. But you will find the books that are there. You buy the books, look at the books, you will find that they contain modern kind of stuff. Obviously, these are not Vedic. These are not from the Vedic times. Let's go to the post-Vedic or Siddhantic period. Now, towards the end of the Vedic period, the emphasis on the ritualistic practices became the binding factor in the society, and people were urging to come out of that. And as a result of that urge, we see the birth of Jainism and Buddhism. And within the 100 years of the demise of Buddha, practically the whole Indian subcontinent became Buddhist. And so we say that from then onwards, we have the post-Vedic period. It is no longer the Vedic period. In this period, we see great developments in many areas of sciences, medical science to start with. Sushruta, Atreya, Jivaka, Charaka, we have heard their names. In fact, Jivaka and Atreya were related to the Takshila Learning Center. And through them, we see certain remarkable developments. Ayurveda as a method of treatment using material things. And surgery. That's extremely rare for that time. Nowhere in the world that happened, that certain methods of surgery were developed, mainly by Sushruta. This is a depiction of that kind of thing. But in Sushruta Samhita, we see mention of certain instruments which cannot but be used only, can be used only in surgery. So we do not know how much success they attained in the surgery because we cannot repeat those procedures that he wrote about in Sushruta Samhita without violating ethics today. We cannot repeat those procedures, so we do not know how much success was there. But at least the fact that he practiced surgery, he invented this kind of surgical instruments, and he taught pupils, students, means that some element of success definitely was attained. In linguistics, we find great development. Panini was the key man there, later Patanjali. Panini in 4th century BC was the finest grammarian of antiquity because pre-Panini Sanskrit grammar and post-Panini Sanskrit grammar are different. The Vedic Sanskrit and what is known as classical Sanskrit are different because Panini formalized the grammatical rules, as a result of which it became easier to learn the language, and as a result of that, Sanskrit became the link language over the whole of the Indian subcontinent. So somebody from Kerala could go to Uttar Pradesh, today's Uttar Pradesh, and give a discourse just because that became a link language. And this is a monumental achievement. This book that I refer to by Professor Vintanitz, The History of Indian Literature, it says, in the earliest ages, the Indians already analyzed their ancient sacred writings with a view to philology, classified the linguistic phenomena as a scientific system, and developed their grammar to so highly that even today, modern philology can use their attainments as a foundation. So this was a great attainment. We have to be proud of these developments. And he devised this alphabet system. You notice that in this alphabet system, the letters, alphabets are arranged in a matrix, 5 by 5 matrix, depending on how much air passes through your mouth and where does the tongue touches the upper part of the mouth. So depending on that. In astronomy, I will not be able to go into the detail of the astronomical development because there are quite a lot to say. I do not have that much time. And moreover, astronomy was very intimately linked with the development of mathematics. So it has to be said in one discussion. It has to be done in one discussion. And Anilji has requested me to leave out mathematics in the main because there will be another discussion specifically focused on that. And I'll assume that whoever discusses that will also cover the astronomical development. So I'll discuss in very brief. You'll find that there are a few books with the common name Siddhanta Jyotisha, written over a period about 100 to 500 AD. And if you notice names of the books, you'll find Surya Siddhanta, Pitama Siddhanta, and all that, but also Romak Siddhanta, Polish Siddhanta, Yavan Siddhanta, and all that. It is clear that that is the result of a time when there was a mixing of the Greek tradition and the Indian tradition, Greek and Roman astronomy. After the invasion of Alexander, those ideas came, and there was a lot of mixing of ideas, and due to which these names we see. Some of these books, scholars maintain that some of these books were written actually by Greek scholars and translated to Sanskrit. Those people of that time were very interested in the periodicity of this motion of the sun. Now we know that the periodicity of the motion of the sun in today's estimate, they estimated is something like this. But it is 365.258. But in those times when this was written, they didn't express in decimal. So they had to express everything in whole numbers. And how do you express that in whole numbers? You state after how many years exactly the sun will come back to the same position. And they notice that after 1 year, it doesn't come back to the same position. It's slightly different. So they try to figure out after how many years sun would come back to exactly the same position, and they figured that that would be a very large number, 4320000 years. They call it a Mahayuga. And their estimate of the year is reasonably accurate. Modern estimate is 365.242, while there was 258. And in theoretical astronomy, there was a great deal of development. For example, Aryabhata, Varamihira, Brahmagupta, Bhaskara, they did a lot of contribution. They made a lot of contribution in theoretical astronomy. And that was influenced by, I would say, there was a regular exchange between the Indian astronomers, Greek astronomers. There was regular exchange between the things that were happening in Alexandria, for example. And there was also a lot of exchange between Indian astronomy and Arabic astronomy. The reason was that during the Arabic Golden Age, Indian literature were translated into Arabic. For example, Brahmagupta's book Brahmasputra Siddhanta was translated into Arabic. Its name was Sindh Hind, and that contributed to the development of Arabic astronomy. And Arabs were obsessed about making star charts and astronomical tables. These were called zijes. And those zijes came back to India. The ones that were actually compiled by the Arabs came back to India when the Islamic people came into India. So and then in India also that was further developed, and those zijes later reached Europe, which formed the basis of much of the development that happened during the Renaissance. I'll just name a couple of people. Aryabhata, for example. The importance of Aryabhata is that he hypothesized for the first time in the world that the earth itself rotates. Very important. We know that for sure today. But in his time, or even 2-3 centuries after him, great people like Brahmagupta and Varamihira contradicted his position. And Aryabhata did not really reach the Copernican model of the solar system. His model was similar to the Ptolemy model. And he explained the solar and lunar eclipses. I'll leave out the people in between. Bhaskara, for example, wrote 3 very important books on astronomy. Graha Ganitam, mathematics of the motion of the planets, computation of the planetary motions, Siddhanta Shiromani, and Goladhyaya. Goladhyaya is spherical astronomy. So he developed spherical astronomy to quite a large extent. So today you will find standing this particular structure. This is the Jantar Mantar. In Delhi there is a Jantar Mantar. In Jaipur there is a Jantar Mantar, and it was built by Sawai Jai Singh. Now the story is rather strange. As I told you, the methods of Indian astronomy went to the Arabs, through the translation of their books. Arabs adopted it and developed it further, and they developed the masonry-based observatories. And the biggest such observatory was in Tashkent. Now, that Tashkent observatory was created by a ruler called Ulugh Beg. And Ulugh Beg was a strange ruler because he was more interested in astronomy rather than ruling. So after some time, he was overruled, he was thrown out, and his observatory was destroyed. Today in Tashkent, you see only the part of that observatory that exists below the ground. But Jai Singh actually adopted his design, and he created his own observatory system in 3-4 places. The largest was in Jaipur. But he was a bit off for his time, because the time you notice, it was completed 1734. It was already in the era of telescopic astronomy. But this was basically naked eye astronomy. Okay, so in mathematics, I just put a time scale. The Sulba Sutras were in the 800 BC to 200 BC period. The Pingala, the Jain mathematician, was 200 BC. The other Jain mathematician was in this period. Aryabhatta was 5th century, Varamihira was 6th century, Brahmagupta was 7th century, Mahavira 9th century, and Bhaskara was in 12th century. So this was the golden age of Indian mathematics, you can say. I'll not go into the details, but then you see a gap. And then we see Srinivasa Ramanujan in the 19th century. What important contributions they made? I'll just quickly go over it. Zero and the place value system, the basis of all mathematics today, were introduced here. Or maybe, we do not know, because there were very close trade links with Southeast Asia, China, India, and the other places. So exactly where it originated, we cannot really pinpoint, but the development happened here. Now, when a new method of writing numbers develops, you have to also create the arithmetic for it, how to add, how to subtract, how to multiply. Those things were developed in Indian soil. In Indian soil, algebra, much of algebra was developed, even the solution of quadratic equation. And they wrote x, y, and all that as the kha and all. So it was possible to write algebraic equation using Sanskrit. They also developed trigonometry. Most of the trigonometric relationships that you study in school today, sin square plus cos square equal to 1, relationships like that, all these were there in Brahmagupta's writing. So these were developed in the Indian soil. A peculiar development happened, solutions of indeterminate equations. If you have one equation and two unknowns, you cannot solve it. But some mathematicians showed that if the variables in the equation are whole numbers and x and y are also whole numbers, then there are solutions. And they worked out how the solutions can be found. In geometry, there were developments, all right, but in geometry, out of all these areas, in geometry, the Greeks excelled. The Indian development in geometry was not as great as the Greek development of geometry. In alchemy, there was a lot of, I'll not say chemistry, it was alchemy, because whenever there is a development in alchemy, it is driven by two arches. One is pottery, glassware, metallurgy, and the other is to produce things that can be used as medicinal substances. So in both these directions, the developments happened, and we find quite a large number of written material on alchemy. So Rasa Ratnakara and things like that. There are many, about 16 documents we have found, and that has been very well studied by Acharya P.C. Ray, who wrote the book, The History of Hindu Chemistry. And in that, we find that there is a great deal of discussion regarding 6 metals: gold, silver, copper, lead, tin, and iron, extraction of that, and things like that. Discussion about 5 types of salts, how to make alkali. The procedure that he discusses, I mean, I could not read in Sanskrit, but I have read the book by Acharya P.C. Ray. The procedure that he discusses essentially leads to the production of potassium carbonate. So that was used as alkali. And you find in Charaka Samhita the use of this substance as a disinfectant. This much development happened in the ancient time, but the later development, mercury, zinc, things like that, what I've written, happened in a later period, like 11th century to about 13th century, when there was a cultivation of the tantras. So tantric system came, and alchemy went to the hands of them, and their writing contained details about mercury and its compounds, and they found that these have some effect on the human body. Extraction of zinc and copper. There is something written called the killing of a metal. Killing of a metal essentially is reacting with certain substance that changes the property of that metal. Essentially, now we understand these are reaction with some acidic substance, so that the metal simply reacts and forms something else. And they also invented certain primitive chemical apparatus to do things. So this much development happened in chemistry. In metallurgy, there were great development. Especially a special kind of steel was developed, in which they made it in small crucibles. The iron was put there with some amount of carbon, and it was put in a furnace, and that produced the steel. And the steel was not only used in India but also exported in Middle East, and from there it went to Europe. And workshops came in the Middle East places, mainly in Damascus, who took the Indian iron, Indian steel, and make swords out of that, and it came to be known as Damascus steel. But it was actually the process was perfected here. If you look at the picture, you will see the typical marking of that wood steel. And this is the picture of the iron pillar that stands in the grounds of the Qutub Minar today, and it has not rusted. Why it has not rusted, it is not unknown. I mean, some people try to create mystery about it, but it's not so mysterious, because the iron ore contains phosphorus, and if iron is mixed with phosphorus, it becomes brittle. So today we do not use that. Today we take out the phosphorus by oxidation, but in those times that was not there. So the iron pillar contains phosphorus, and that is what is responsible for its non-rusting character. But that particular thing is actually brittle. It does not break because it's so huge, so large. So that's why it doesn't break. Some centers of learning developed. Takshila, Nalanda, Vikramshila, Vallabhi, Jagaddal, Odantapuri, and so on and so forth. In the Buddhist period, these were not during the Vedic period. In the Buddhist period, in the style of Buddhist culture, Buddhist stupa, people aggregated in one place, had learning. But in these places, the teachers would teach a number of students, maybe 30 to 50 students, and a number of teachers, number of students will live in the same place, in the same compound, and various subjects were taught. But important thing to note is that this was teaching and learning in one place, but what would be taught and learned, that would depend on the teacher. So it was basically personal. And in that sense, these places cannot be called true universities, because in universities we have a curriculum, and teachers have to teach that curriculum, and that curriculum is formed out of what is positive knowledge, what is known for sure on the basis of evidence, which had not developed at that time. As I said, the philosophical currents contained Lokayata, Sankhya, Vedanta, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and all that. But certain important theoretical developments happened, including the development of the atomic theory. Kanada was probably the first person to talk about everything is composed of minute particles called atoms. So you notice that the golden age of science in India was something like the 5th century to about 11th century. That is when Aryabhata was in 5th century, and discovery of zero and place value system happened that time, and most of the things happened in this period. But after that, we find a gap, and then if you want to take names of people who did science, we have to take Jagadish Chandra Bose, Prafula Chandra Ray, C.V. Raman, Ramanujan, Meghnad Saha, Satyendranath Bose. All these were in the 19th and 20th century. So what happened in between? Now, what happened in between is, this is the question that was faced by Acharya P.C. Ray when he was writing the book, The History of Hindu Chemistry. And he identified three causative factors. The most important, he says, is the introduction of casteism in a rigid form. Casteism was there in the Vedic time, but it sort of lost its steam during the Buddhist period. But again, it was reintroduced in a very rigid form in the 7th, 8th century onwards. So we see when there is a casteism, the doers and thinkers become separate with no communication between them. And P.C. Ray says that you cannot have any science unless you have a communication between the doers and the thinkers. And in those times, the strictures, the do's and don'ts, the Manu Samhita introduced certain strictures. This is what can be done, this is what cannot be done, and things like that. And one of the things you cannot do was touching cadavers, touching the dead bodies. And P.C. Ray identified that as a death knell of the cult of surgery that was developing in India. Because in order to do surgery, the teacher has to teach a student by cutting the dead body, and you cannot do that if that kind of strictures are there. And the last thing he identifies as the dominance of the Vedanta philosophy after Shankara's time. And the Vedanta philosophy teaches people to look at nature as illusion, Maya. And P.C. Ray says that if you look at the material world as illusion, you can do no science. So these three are the causative factors behind the decline and fall of science in India. And it again started rising from what is known as the Indian Renaissance that was spearheaded by Raja Ram Mohan Ray and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. And in the next generation itself, notice the timings. Vidyasagar was 1820 to 1891. And then in next generation itself, you see a plethora of scientists that we are proud of today. So this happened because they brought in the air of European Renaissance into the Indian soil, and through that, again, the curiosity of the Indian population was rejuvenated, and that resulted in this great scientist emergence. I'll just stop by referring to what is there in the new education policy. I've outlined how much actual, true, documented developments happen in India. Now, the new education policy says that the rich heritage of ancient and eternal Indian knowledge and thought has been a guiding light for this policy. So we are elated to see that, yes, all these developments that happened will now be studied by students. It even says in Article 4.27, knowledge of India will include something that will be introduced in the curriculum, will include knowledge from ancient India and its contribution to modern India and its successes and challenges. They give a coin and name, Indian knowledge systems, including tribal knowledge, indigenous and traditional ways of learning will be covered and included in mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, yoga, architecture, medicine, agriculture, engineering, linguistics, and all that. When these subjects will be taught, it will be taught in the light of the Indian knowledge systems. And an engaging course in Indian knowledge system will be available to students in the secondary level. Good. But the question is, what do they understand as the Indian knowledge system? What do they understand as the knowledge system that existed in ancient India? Notice what their own understanding is. This man, who is the chief minister of one state, says that cow is the only animal that exhales oxygen. Because apparently he says that that is what is written in the ancient texts. This man, Biplab Dev, the Tripura chief minister, he says that internet and television existed in the days of Mahabharata. Otherwise, how could Sanjay give a running commentary of the Mahabharata war to the dead, to the blind king? So obviously this existed according to him. So they think that these existence of the internet, the television, and then there was the talk about the aircraft in ancient India. There was a few years back, a paper was presented in the Indian Science Congress in which somebody called some Captain Bodas, he said that in ancient India, he said 9,000 years back. I have already said that even the Vedic age started 1500 BC, so 1500 plus about 2,000 years will be 3,500 years, not 9,000 years. But he said that 9,000 years back, this kind of aircraft used to fly all over. Fortunately, a group of aeronautical engineers in the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, they studied these sort of designs, and they concluded these things cannot fly because they violate the elementary laws of aerodynamics. This man, who was the Minister of State for Education, Satyapal Singh, says that Darwin's theory is wrong. Why? Because nobody saw ape turning into man. So this is, according to them, the ancient Indian knowledge. And our great Prime Minister, Narendra Modi himself, says that genetic science existed in ancient times. The Karna and Ganesha were examples of cosmetic surgery and reproductive genetics thousands of years ago. So you see, this is what they understand as ancient Indian knowledge. And this is what is now attempted to be introduced in the curriculum. While what I presented are documented evidence of what actually happened in India and what we should be proud of. So I'll stop here. And before I stop, I'll just play a short video of a speech by the education, who was the education minister till a few days back, Nishank. And
लाखों वर्ष पहले ऋषि कणाद ने किया था इस धरती पर। अणु बम का परीक्षण लाखों वर्ष पहले ऋषि कणाद ने किया था इस धरती पर। हमारा ज्ञान और विज्ञान में कोई कमी नहीं है। जिस बारे में हास्यास्पद स्थिति में कहा जा रहा था कि गणेश जी का शीर्ष अलग हो, लाखों वर्ष पहले ऋषि कणाद ने किया था इस धरती पर। हमारा ज्ञान और विज्ञान में कोई कमी नहीं है। जिस बारे में हास्यास्पद स्थिति में कहा जा रहा था कि गणेश जी का शीर्ष अलग हो गया और दक्ष प्रजापति का शीर्ष अलग हो गया, तो वो सर्जरी थी। जी थी, वो पूरी दुनिया में वो विज्ञान कहाँ है जो हमारे पास है। सिर से धड़ अलग होने पर उस धड़ पर सिर का प्रत्यारोपण करने का जो विज्ञान था, वो गणित थी, वो ज्ञान था तो केवल हिंदुस्तान की धरती पर था। और ज्योतिष का तो श्रीमान लाखों वर्ष पहले लाखों वर्ष आगे की गणना करने वाला विज्ञान तो ज्योतिष के सामने बौना है। यदि इस विज्ञान को उसके आगे बढ़ाना चाहिए। और इसलिए मैं कहना चाहता हूं, ये ज्योतिष विज्ञान सारी दुनिया के लिए नंबर 1 है श्रीमान। इस पे चर्चा होनी चाहिए। केवल कुछ शब्दों में कह करके उस ज्योतिष विज्ञान को जो सारी दुनिया का मार्गदर्शन करता है।
Okay, I'll stop now, and now Shreya can continue.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your what you have presented. It was very well presented, I feel, and it was just like going back in history and following the brief history that has happened till now. So thank you, sir, for that. We have a couple of questions here, so we'll just take them one by one.
Yes.
Ramamurthy, she asks if can you please explain why no one in the West, even in India, makes reference to the Indian contribution to science? Only Greek, Chinese and Arabic contributions are mentioned. Do we lack PR? That is her question.
This is not quite true. Actually, the Indian contributions of in science are actually well known. It is not that nobody talks about it. What I presented is not that I have researched and found from primary material. These are all written in books, presented. These are available. The only issue is that the powers that be do not publicize these developments. They talk about other things which I just showed, that this is what they talk about. But supposing that those who introduce the new education policy talk about these developments, then we have nothing to say about it. But that did not happen. That is why you feel that our own achievements are sort of sidelined. No, these are not. Our scholars have talked about it. Even foreign scholars have talked about it. It's not that only our scholars.
Yes, true, sir. So the next question we have is from Vishnu Narayana. He says, as attention to astronomy started during Vedic times, do we have any evidence of any form study that happened over monsoons? Since India is a tropical country, it is difficult to pinpoint the monsoons. So, any such study during the Vedic times?
Not that I know of. They have talked about monsoons, all right, but scientific study of monsoon, when it comes, when it goes, I didn't see that. No.
Okay, so what he's basically asking is, sir, that whether there was any weather study in India, like could we predict that the monsoons are going to come?
I don't know.
Okay. Next we have Anuradha Jaglur asking, what about architecture? Legend has it that Nalanda libraries were multi-story buildings. Is there any truth in that?
Okay, firstly, regarding architecture, I have to tell you that during the Indus Valley age, we can see the architecture because we have those remains. These are brick built buildings. But from that time until the Gupta age, there is not a single brick built building that is found. Okay, so that's a very long time, about 1,000 years, when there was no construction out of brick. After that, we see the construction of brick built buildings, and Nalanda is one of them. Nalanda was actually built mainly during the Gupta period, so we see. Now, yes, what we see in Nalanda today are mainly, not multi-story structures, except one building there, standing there. But Yuan Sang, the Chinese man who visited India during I suppose it was during the 7th century, so he visited Nalanda, and he reports certain things, having seen certain things, and that includes multi-story buildings. So we have to trust that. So we can say that yes, multi-story buildings, at least 3-4 story buildings, did exist at the time. Moreover, he mentions having seen a very large statue of Buddha made of pure copper. So which means that they could make pure copper. Extraction of copper is not a very easy thing, pure copper.
Right. So the next question that we have is again from Vishnu Narayan. He says, why does modern science look down to the ancient Indian medical science? Is it due to lack of necessary evidences, empirical proofs? Do we need more study to understand what was done that can be followed, accepted in this modern time as well?
Firstly, modern science does not discount the empirical knowledge that is reflected in Ayurveda. That's a wrong idea. No, that's not true. What modern science says is that these may be, empirical observations of some ancient people, but it has to be validated using these have to be validated using modern techniques. For example, if Ayurveda says that a particular herb reduces the blood pressure, that needs to be tested properly using normal randomized trial, where you take a large number of volunteers, you divide that into the control group, the experimental group, you apply it on the experimental group, don't apply on the control group, then do the test, do the statistical survey, and then you come to the conclusion that this is what actually is the effect. Until this is done, modern science always takes things with a pinch of salt. Just because it was written in there, we will accept it. That's not the position of modern science. But modern science does not say whatever is written in the Ayurveda books are wrong. Never says that. It only demands that let us test that and then accept that.
Correct, sir. Very true. Okay. I think those are the questions that we have from our audience. I just had a couple of questions from my side, sir. So I would just like to ask them. So with social media spreading false facts around science in ancient India, How can one try to debunk these?
By actually propagating the truth. See, whatever I was showing as their opinion, you will find more in the WhatsApp University. Hmm? You will see that Manchester University has said that Newton stole from ancient Indian. Have you seen that? You have seen that,
Yes.
definitely. You have seen that. So this kind of stuff are being propagated. And you see, it is not only the Prime Minister who says that Ganesha's head was, an example of a plastic surgery. If you really try to do that, the size, the circumference of a human neck and the circumference of a elephant's head are entirely different. You simply cannot imagine putting one on top of the other, but still people believe. Now, point is that in that case, those who understand what is truth, see, falsehood cannot be negated by simply contradicting the falsehood. The falsehood has to be negated by putting forward the truth. That is why we have to say what actually existed, what we should really be proud of, and not these things.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
That's my take on this.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. So the next question that I have is, we see that many have started these Vedic mathematics classes nowadays. Many do it, and people believe that they're actually Vedic. So, what are your thoughts on these? Is it actually Vedic mathematics or what?
Yeah, I would advise people to read the writings of two important academicians. One is Professor S.G. Dani, who has written extensively on this question of Vedic mathematics. The other is Professor Jayant Narlikar, who has also written extensively on Vedic mathematics. What they both say is that what goes in the name of Vedic mathematics is neither Vedic nor mathematics. Why neither Vedic? Firstly, these were not from the Vedic time. These were written in the modern time by somebody who had studied modern mathematics. Only he knew Sanskrit, so he wrote this in the Sanskrit language. Okay, that was one person from the Puri Mutt. I forgot the name, but the initial book was by him. And why is it not mathematics? Because mathematics is a way of thinking in terms of abstract way of thinking. So we see 2 cows, 3 bananas, 4 apples, and we abstract that into 3, 4, 5. Then we have the continuum of numbers, and then continuum of numbers can be abstracted into continuum of space and things like that. So it is a way of thinking that leads to some theorems, some results, which can then be applied back to physical reality. So that is mathematics. What these books say is essentially some ways of calculation, which is not mathematics. Now, are these calculations useful? That's another question. If that allows you to calculate fast, is it useful? Well, today we do not need to calculate fast because you cannot calculate faster than a calculator. But still, are they useful? The point is that each of these, for example, there is one sutra called Ekadhikana Purvena. So what comes before, add 1 to it, essentially that. And with that, formula, you can do certain things. But for example, you can obtain a square of 535. Not easy to do by hand, but you can quickly do that using that. But that doesn't apply with anything that ends with 7. So it's useless, because in that case you have to remember another sutra for 7, another sutra for 3. So it actually increases your labor rather than reducing it.
Correct.
Okay. So it's neither mathematics nor Vedic.
Correct. We can rather come up with our own shortcuts in mathematics
Yeah.
and make mathematics simpler. Right. Okay. So we have another question here, sir, from Rajat Vasudev Murthy. So what's the evidence for Vedic age to be from 1500 BC?
Oh, what is the evidence? Well,
Yeah.
there are a few. Firstly, horse. Horse is an animal that is not found in any Indian forest. So horse is not an Indian animal. But in whole of Vedic literature, you see reference to the horse. So horse is a very important clue. When do we find horse first in Indian soil? So people went around and tried to find out horse fossils, and the first horse fossil was found in Swat Valley. Swat Valley is in Pakistan today. Yeah. So that fossil has been dated and found to be around 1600 BC. Okay. So before that, we do not see any horse fossil, and it is assumed that the Aryans came with the horse because horses are found in Asia Minor. From there, they came with the horse riding tribe. So that puts a time. The other is linguistic. The linguistic timing is like this, that if in your own language, Kannada for example, there will be some words. If you tell a linguist that I have found this word, he would be able to tell a particular time before which this particular sentence could not have been constructed. Why? Because this word is there. And the word comes into a language at a particular time. So the way animals evolved, the way various things evolved, that way languages also evolved. And by looking at a particular language and its construction, its use of words, one can figure out in which time it was written. That way we know that the oral form of the Rig Vedas were constructed sometime between 1500 and 1008 BC. And at the time writing was not there, so everything was communicated by Shruti and Smriti. And later, after 1000 BC, writing developed and things started being written. So from the linguistic construction, for example, in Mahabharata, you find that different passages of the Mahabharata have different languages. Construction, grammatical style are different. And the most recent is the Gita part. Most recent. So you know that Mahabharata was not written by one man. Why? Because the languages are different in different parts. So the linguistic evidence also point out that it started around 1500. And the third evidence is there is no cultural link between the Indus Valley civilization and the Vedic age. Because had there been a cultural link, the Vedic people would know how to make bricks. They didn't. Okay, so there must have been some gap between the demise of the Indus Valley civilization and the incoming of the Aryans.
Correct. So we have another question here from Shashidhara Dongre. Is there any material evidence for the hypothesis that race of casteism is responsible for decline in scientific progress? Any pointers to research in this area?
Well, that was a point made by Acharya P.C. Ray on the basis of the observation that during the period when there was, casteism was not a dominant phenomenon in India. In that time, we see all these developments in science. And again, when casteism became, when Brahminical Hinduism, as it's called, became the dominant phenomenon in India, we see a decline in form. And his argument was that the reason that he says that casteism is responsible is that in order for science to progress, you have to observe the nature. That means you have to interact with it. And interaction happens if you work with nature. So you have to be a doer, somebody who does things. In a casteist society, the Shudras or the low caste actually do things. And the upper caste actually do not do. They only think. So the doers and thinkers become separate, with not only no communication between them, but even one treating another as untouchable. In that situation, science cannot flourish. His point was this. It was a theoretical point. In order for any society to have science, there must be a link between the doer and the doer. You're muted, yes.
Yes, sir. So, I think we have another couple of questions here. And Anil sir also, he mentions a book called Surabha Yarappa, called Science in India. He says that that book can be used to observe truths about the ancient India.
Sure, sure. I have not read that book, but yes, sure.
Okay. Yeah, Anuradha Jaglush, he has another question. Vastu appears to have acquired a life of its own nowadays. But what about its origin? Where were some of its original rules based on any observational truth?
Vastu seems to be of a recent origin. Vastu is not ancient. Vastu is not found in any ancient text. So this seems to be of a recent origin. Well, I don't know who originated that or in what form, but the way I said that astrology has some basic beliefs that everybody's life is determined by the time of the birth is the basic belief of astrology. In a similar way, Vastu Shastra also has some basic belief that certain directions of the door is good, certain directions of the cot, certain position of the cot where you lie down is good, certain position is bad, and there is something called positive energy that goes into the house. If you read the books, you will find nothing like that, nothing of mention of a positive energy, negative energy. Obviously, there cannot be any negative energy, so all energies are positive. So there cannot be any concentration of positive energy in a particular place of the house, so you will be there. Nonsense. But this nonsense was not there in any Vedic literature. That's what I'm pointing. This is not of an ancient origin.
Correct. We have another question on calendars by Vinod Gowda. He asks, how come a weekend is 7 days in Gregorian as well as Hindu calendars? The name of the days are attributed to the same celestial objects in both the calendars. Where is the origin for these names and numbers?
Well, as I said, the Vedic people identified 12 months. These 12 months were 30 days in length, but the year is 365 days. So you have got 5 days to take care of somehow. Okay, so in those times, all these were the normal months, and there was one Malmas. It used to be called the unholy month or something like that, comprising these many days. Okay, so in those times, the month was identified, the year was identified, the Ritu was identified, but the week was not. Week was a relatively recent inclusion. Week was not from Vedic time. As far as I know, I may know wrong. Yeah, that's true. That's possible. But as far as I know, week was not there.
Okay. So we have a last question here by Rama Murthy again. She asks, did the British purposely kill science education in India?
Well, they tried, but they failed. They tried to kill science education in India, but they failed because our people, the giants of Indian Renaissance, Ram Mohan, Vidyasagar, and people like that, forced them to introduce. So it is not that they wanted to introduce scientific education. No, they didn't. And there was a lot of exchange of argument, counter argument between these people and the British administration at that time. They asked the British administration not to start Sanskrit college, rather start colleges that will teach modern science, modern philosophy, English. So it is not they wanted. These people realized the importance of opening the mind's door to the European Renaissance ideas. And so they wanted science to be taught. The new curriculum that Vidyasagar introduced in his college included mathematics, included science, and he made it a point that mathematics can be taught in Sanskrit as well as in English, but we will teach in English. Why? Because the Sanskrit part of the mathematics is basically something that was written by Bhaskaracharya. At that time, it was actually taught. Lilavati was actually taught. But this has outlived its time. For its time, it was great, but for today, it is not great, and therefore we have to teach the mathematics that is great for today. So he introduced mathematics teaching in English. So actually, scientific education, science education, the British did not want to bring because they only wanted to create a band of clerks. Science is not needed for them, but these people forced the British to introduce science.
Yes, they played a very good role in building Indian science here, and that's why we can see stalwarts of science in the past.
Yeah.
Right
Calcutta
from
University did not have a master's program in physics, for example.
Correct.
When
Yeah.
Ashutosh Mukherjee became the vice chancellor, he saw that it has to be done, so he picked up two persons who were at that time students. They were not studying physics; they were studying applied mathematics. One was Satyendranath Bose, another was Meghnad Saha. He simply picked them up, put them there, and gave them the responsibility starting with physics department. Look, was it done by the British? No.
Correct. I think these are lesser known facts which many of us don't know. So these should be highlighted. One last question, Soumitra sir. Please comment on Dashavatara connected to evolution.
Well, see, in the mythological text, we find this idea of things being in the sea and then things in the land. And the only connection they point out is that, yes, in the process of evolution, things were first in the sea and then they came to the land. And that's the only connection. It is not true that the sequence of things that you see in the Dashavatara was the actual way the evolution happened. No, not like that at all. So the link is actually far-fetched. Actually, the link was sort of thought of only after the Darwin's discovery of natural selection. This is one point I will make. All these claims you will find, they came after the science discovered something. That there were aircraft in the ancient India, that claim did not come before aircraft were there in physical reality. Somebody claiming that the ancient people knew about quantum mechanics did not happen before quantum mechanics was developed. In a similar way, this idea that Dashavatara actually is process of evolution did not lead to the discovery of the process of evolution. The other way around, the process of evolution was discovered, and then somebody said, "Okay, here it says a link." No, the link is far-fetched. There is no link other than there are some of the Dashavatara avatars who are sea-going animals, and there are some who are land-going animals, and the sea-going animals come first. Other than that, there is no link at all.
Right. Thank you, sir. That was much required, actually. Finally, sir, what would you? I would just like a comment from you on how important, actually, this whatever we have quoted, like ancient science in India, why they must be given in the school textbooks. Their importance. Could you just highlight a few points?
See, my point is that this in history, you study what was there earlier. But history is taught as a collection of, dates, times, names of kings, so that it becomes a dry thing. But if you teach history as also encompassing the development of ideas, how this idea developed, how that idea developed, then obviously the actual development of science in ancient India will be a part of that. So I would plead for teaching history in a different way, rather than introducing this as a separate subject in the curriculum. The difficulty of that is that whoever will teach this subject will teach according to his or her own personal judgment. So, introducing a separate course as Indian knowledge system is a dangerous thing, because what I just talked about as what really happened in history, that will not be taught, something else will be taught, and what will be taught is dependent on whoever teaches his own personal beliefs. This is dangerous. But if it is a part of history teaching, then it can be given a scientific position. That means only those things that are supported by evidence will be taught.
Correct. Thank you, sir. So we do have many appreciation comments here. So many have commented that it was a very informative talk. Thank you, and it was an excellent talk, sir. Then yeah, so whatever happened, whatever has happened in between, that was an eye opener. So thank you for that. So these are some of the main comments that we have here, sir. So I thank you, Professor Soumitra Banerjee, sir, on behalf of Breakthrough Science Society Karnataka, for giving us time to speak here. And I also thank Anil sir and his family for organizing this event on behalf of Breakthrough Science Society Karnataka. And finally, thank you all viewers for joining us today. Anything, you can always come back. You can sign up for membership with Breakthrough Science Society. Link will be put in the chat box. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.